If you're hearing my voice right now, I can be reasonably sure you want to hear more in-depth, long-form cultural conversation on public radio, on podcasts, and everywhere else in between. I want to hear that too. In fact, I want to make it happen. That's why I do this show. It's the whole mission of the Marketplace of Ideas, you might say. But to do it, the show needs 10,000 podcast subscribers by the end of 2011. It sounds like a lot, but I think we can get there if you help by tweeting about the show, retweeting my tweets about the show. I tweet under the username Colin Marshall, by making Facebook posts about your favorite interviews, by blogging about the show, by even just telling friends they ought to tune in, brightening their aesthetic, intellectual, and radio-y lives by passing along some favorite conversations to them. We'll need 211 more listeners this week alone to make our goal, so bear that in mind, too. Thanks. Andrei Tarkovsky, Franz Kafka, Thomas Bernhard, Béla Tarr, Maurice Blanchot. What do these artists have in common besides the fact that the main characters in your novel talk about them a lot?
I suppose what they have in common is a kind of integrity, artistic or philosophical integrity. And by this, what I mean is they concentrate in their work an importance, a seriousness, a sense that there is something worth struggling for in life. I think that's what these figures embody, and especially to the characters of the novel.
From KCSB in Santa Barbara and Colin Marshall Radio, I'm Colin Marshall, and this is the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm speaking today with Lars Iyer, lecturer in philosophy at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, the author of books on Blanchot, and the blogger behind the blog Spurious, and now the author of the novel Spurious, which do share some material between them, and in a very interesting way, I think. But I want to get clear on these artists who do embody this kind of seriousness. This is a quality that the main characters in your novel, W and Lars, they both long for and are also convinced they can never attain, correct?
That's right. They believe something divides them from artists, modernist artists like Kafka, like Blanchot or these sorts of figures, but also from contemporary artists like the Hungarian film director Béla Tarr. So for W and Lars, there's a huge distance between them and these artists, these philosophers as well, that they admire.
Now, I have to say, I personally am an admirer of a lot of these people, Béla Tarr especially. I do love his films. And, you know, there's a sense in which I think about them. I'll watch a Béla Tarr film and say, wow, this guy's better at filmmaking than I am, but at no point do I think he's on a different plane. What is it in their backgrounds that W and Lars think this guy is on a different plane?
I think it's a sense of seriousness. Someone like Béla Tarr feels able to explore topics with great narrative slowness. He feels able to convey to his audience a bleakness of vision and an apocalyptic sensibility, which for Lars and W is everything they struggle for. What they lack, however, is a sense in which they themselves could put this bleakness of vision, this kind of sensibility in their own work. They feel that they lack a relationship to those topics which Béla Tarr enters into with such confidence.
Now let's talk a little bit about the work that Lars and W do. I don't believe in the book they call themselves philosophers, but it seems as if that's what they are. And they have this striving for abstraction. W especially is always talking about the abstraction that he knows he'll never be able to attain. But at the same time, we know we're talking about Béla Tarr. When they talk about Béla Tarr, when W does, he talks about Béla Tarr's, the richness of the concreteness that he works with in his films. You know, he says Béla Tarr would make more out of the paper bag or the plastic bags, perhaps, in the backyard than anything we've ever spoken about. So these characters, they feel they're both too far away from abstraction to be abstract and too far away from concreteness to be concrete?
That's right. They're doubly alienated. They admire Béla Tarr in particular for his devotion to the concrete, which is quite the opposite of their enthusiasm for lofty philosophical ideas. Now, Lars and W, I guess, this is what the novel suggests, are lecturers in philosophy or theology, something in this area. And their conception of a philosopher is something very lofty. For them, a philosopher, a thinker, is someone who, in Nietzsche's words, constantly experiences, sees, hears, suspects, hopes, dreams extraordinary things. So that is what a philosopher is for these characters. And they feel they haven't been able to see or experience these things. They haven't been able to discover an idea which would be an original, which would be an original contribution to thought. At the same time, however, they feel alienated from the ordinary world, from the everyday. They feel alienated not in the sense that they're too good for it or that they have floated loftily above it. Rather, they feel they can't even attain the concrete. And it's certainly true that when they look out the window of Lars's very damp flat, when they look into the yard, the person they dream of is Béla Tarr. Only Béla Tarr would be able to reveal to them exactly what the yard was.
Are Lars and W, can I say they're in a way enslaved to the ideas they have about their predecessors, about their heroes is maybe the wrong word, but about their iconic figures, their potential leaders like the Blanchots, like the Béla Tarrs? Are they held back by the mental constructions they have made out of these people, out of these concrete people to which they will never live up?
I suppose I see it more optimistically, that Lars and W respond to something in these thinkers. They respond to something real, something that's missing in our contemporary world. So they're actually responding to something which is worthwhile. They have an instinct. The problem is that instinct is not something which has led them to become thinkers on a similar level or artists on a similar level to the figures they admire.
I want to get a sense of what's holding Lars and W back. That's going to be an unanswerable question, I think, if I posed it that way. But they talk so much, especially W. So much of this book is consumed by talk about how stupid they are. Idiocy is a word that comes up over and over again that W applies to the both of them, more to Lars than to himself. But they're always talking about how their lack of understanding, their lack of originality, their lack of abstraction and concreteness. I mean, it would seem to me that a lot of what's holding them back are their convictions in their inabilities. Does that sound reasonable to you?
I suppose to me there is something like inability.
Yes, well, of course there is
something. I would say that I myself would suffer from inability. The book is really a dramatization of conversations I've had with a great friend of mine, and both of us would genuinely feel that despite all the time we've had to study, despite the great luxury of having academic jobs, we've been unable to come up with ideas which are truly original. Now, one thing we do have is the sense that we're idiots, at least. I mean, that's something which is very important. There's a wonderful psychology professor at Cornell, Dunning, who discovered that in order to know how good you are at something, it requires the same skills and aptitude as it does to be good at that thing in the first place. And this means if you're really good at something, then you know how to tell how good you are. But also, conversely, that when you're no good at something, you haven't got the skills to realize this. Idiots, generally speaking, don't know they're idiots, and that's their tragedy. Now, Lars and Will actually do have an awareness of their idiocy, and perhaps this is a ground for hope. Perhaps, on that account, they're not quite as idiotic as they take themselves to be.
Now, this is something brought up toward the end of this book, toward the end of Spurious, that, well, Socrates knew he knew nothing, and that was something W and Lars, they know their idiocy, so perhaps they're not such idiots after all?
Well, certainly towards the end of the novel, W believes he's on the brink of having a genuine idea. And perhaps one of the ways in which he reaches this idea is because, like Socrates, he knows nothing. So perhaps there's a similar wisdom in having a sense of your own imposture, especially of the imposture of your self-satisfaction. So perhaps the possibility of thinking is linked to a depth of feeling of your own stupidity.
Now, these two Lars and W, the conversation sometimes turns toward the life of the intellectual, or the life of the European intellectual, is what W sometimes calls it, and how they aren't living it. But what is the life of the intellectual to which they refer? I mean, what are the characteristics of this life that they're not getting to?
I suppose for both characters, there's an admiration for what is called in the novel Old Europe. And Old Europe would be that place in which thinkers and writers and artists are able to practice with the right kind of seriousness and investment in their work. Lars and W, by contrast, work in contemporary Britain, and they feel contemporary Britain is a place hostile to thought. And I suppose, looking beyond the novel, the reasons for that hostility would be something which I've encountered in my own life, and that is the gradual neoliberalization of Britain over the last 2 or 3 decades. So what we've seen is a shutting off of those possibilities, which opened here for a while in the post-war welfare state, in European-style social democracy. But more than that, also in a positive sense in which the ideas, the writers of Europe are welcomed and celebrated. So for Lars and W, they're living in difficult times where they can only imagine what it might be to be a real thinker, to be really engaged in philosophical questions, to be really creative when it comes to the arts.
Some of the people I talk to, especially on this program, will say that not just in political ways, but perhaps in cultural ways, Britain is not particularly welcoming to a pursuit that doesn't look like you're doing anything, a pursuit like thought. I mean, is that something that you've also experienced?
I think this is something which is becoming stronger and stronger every day, particularly in the wake of the great cuts that have been announced recently in the higher education budget. Unfortunately, Britain seems to be dedicated to a neoliberal path, to the blind worship of money, to the driving away of any kind of expansiveness or openness or excitingness of thought. So this is something which I certainly experience, and many people I know would say exactly the same thing.
Now, there's a deeper question I need to get into here, which is that, I mean, can the love of thought, can the drive to think original thoughts, is that something that can so easily be exterminated by political means, by market means? I mean, it seems, or is that just easier to do in England than other places?
I suppose we deprive the possibility of there being individuals coming in to study, say, philosophy at university who wouldn't have had a chance otherwise to study philosophy. We deprive these people who come from backgrounds which are not wealthy or privileged. We deprive them of the chance to study these great ideas and to be able to contribute to them in turn. So that's my great concern. Our culture is not such that it allows any sense for people of this kind of background that they too can become thinkers, that they too can intervene in intellectual life.
This is something that I think I should establish before getting further into this and how this relates to what Lars and W do and what they say. But you've mentioned earlier how there's maybe not necessarily desperation, but there's a longing for an original thought. What would an original thought look like? I have trouble conceiving of complete originality of thought. I'm sure you know what I mean by that.
Certainly. Well, let's have a think. One example I might give is that of the great German Jewish thinker Franz Rosenzweig. And one of the things he's known for is for developing what he called the new thinking. And the new thinking is a combination of philosophy and theology. And the idea is to move away from the emphasis on an abstract, atemporal attempt to grasp reality from an absolute standpoint, to move away from that to a consideration of what it might mean to be an individual human being in relation to God. And I suppose Rosenzweig's great originality is to put forward an argument that speech is the way in which our moral self awakens. The address that we make to the other human being is, for Rosenzweig, the way in which we come to ourselves and the way in which, in turn, we relate ourselves to God. So by speaking to the other, we come into our moral life and we're able to relate to what is important, what is real. So that's what I would give as an example of an original thought, and it's one which set in motion a whole bunch of other thinkers who, responding to Rosenzweig, developed their own thoughts in turn.
How much can we define, or I don't know if definition is what we want to do here, but, when Lars and W want an original thought, how much can we say that they want to have thoughts that when written out, when spoken, will then set off those waves through the philosophical community? Is that at all correct?
That's exactly right. And not just the philosophical community, but through reality in general, through people all over the world. So the idea for them is thought would be linked to opening up some kind of productive uniqueness each of us would have. Each of us would have at the core of our being. And in becoming aware of that, in making that explicit, this would change the world in some way. There's a wonderful quotation from Emerson which comes to mind here. As Emerson says, "Beware when the great God lets loose a thinker on this planet. Then all things are at risk. It is when a conflagration has broken out in a great city, and no man knows what is safe or where will it end." Where it will end. That's Emerson.
There's, of course, a lot we can say here about what speech can do, what spoken and written ideas can do, and, of course, the themes of this book are very much tied up in speech and the power of it. But the fascinating thing there is the different ways speech get used in the book, because in the U.S. press materials, one of the frequently asked questions included is why does W abuse Lars so much? Why is he so mean to Lars? Evidently, this kind of speech is not so well known in the U.S. as a means of friendship. But you said this was a dramatization. Is it much of an exaggeration? This sort of abuse?
Well, in that case, not particularly. But this is part of a black humour, which might be more characteristic of a British humour. It might be something we find over here more than in other countries. I'm not sure how that would work. But it's a particular variety of gallows humour. And certainly Lars comes in for this from W. But W also subjects himself to this kind of cruelty. I wonder whether sometimes there's not an importance to cruelty, that a kind of masochism in thought might be what drives us to overturn imposture, pompousness, the sense in which we're too important for the world. So that's how I would see the contribution W makes as being something useful, something which can goad one to take control of our life, take control of one's life, and live in a different way. I should add here, there's a wonderful phrase the philosopher Levinas uses, and Levinas is a philosopher influenced by Rosenzweig. And what he says is, one of our great tasks is to contest, to resist what he calls ontological tumefaction. Those honours, titles, and assumption of professional competence, which he says weighs us down. So for Levinas, the great task is to refuse a conception of what it means to be a human being in terms of our satisfaction, in terms of our receipts and expenditures. So for him, I wonder whether this notion of masochism might not have a positive sense. So W's cruelty would be liberating. Certainly, I find something of that.
Can I say then that in the world of Spurious and in your own life and where they overlap, you perhaps believe that if you're going to work on this abstract plane, if you're going to seek these original ideas, if you're going to operate potentially at this high level, you must also subject yourself or have someone subject you to a constant process of deflation here on the earthly plane?
Absolutely right. Constant deflation. And, we should feel humbled, those of us who teach philosophy. I mean, I wouldn't call myself a philosopher in any sense. I try and teach philosophy. We should be humbled by the brilliance of the thoughts that we try and convey to students, the thoughts that we try and convey in our publications. The brilliance of these thoughts is such that, with respect to them, our efforts are insignificant.
Is there a sense in which we here, we alive today, no matter what we're thinking, can't know the importance of the thoughts we have? I mean, this will be judged after our deaths, in many cases long after. Is that an expectation we should have?
Well, that could well be the case. I think of, let's have a figure like Kepler. Newton reads Kepler and draws out of Kepler's thoughts all kinds of unexpected things which Kepler himself did not understand in their full importance. So it took a Newton to expose what was there implicitly in Kepler and transform those ideas and pass them on. And likewise today, perhaps that's something which might also happen. We all dream of writing something which is perhaps translated into another language, finds its way halfway around the world, and someone picks it up and has a thought of their own. So the dream of inspiring someone else to have a thought is a very exciting one.
There's a central element, a couple central elements to the book that I think that I can't put off bringing up any longer, because of course I mentioned the names of those artists at the beginning of the conversation, but for Lars and W, none seem to stand higher, and correct me if I'm wrong, but than Kafka and Blanchot. Now, are those at the top of the heap for them?
I think Kafka would be at the top of the heap.
Okay.
Blanchot less so, I'd say.
But tell me, is it talking about their relationship to those two artists, those two thinkers, is it worth me framing it as the characters' relationship, or can I just as well say you and the real life inspirational interlocutor? I mean, how much of a wall should I keep up between the real life and the book?
There's not much of a wall.
Oh, okay.
In this case, I guess there's not much of a wall. I mean, someone like Kafka is fascinating. It's fascinating so many authors in the 20th century. Approaching him now, around the turn of the millennium, in the 21st century, something else stands out. So we can look at his fiction, we can look at his novels, these unfinished, posthumously published works, these stories, notebook fragments, aphorisms and letters. These are all marked by a sense of a vanished religious authority. So some kind of vanished authority. Many of his fictions are similar to parables. They seem to have a code. They seem to point to some meaning hidden to the reader. But alas, as we know, they're not truly allegorical. There is no truth behind the fable. And in this sense, what they seem to present to us is a revelation of the impossibility of revelation, an allegory of the absence of truth. Now, this has been the Kafka who is well known for many thinkers, many writers in the 20th century. But Kafka was also marked by a faith in his vocation as a writer, a wavering faith, it is true, but one which remained to him. And I wonder whether the characters W and Lars are able to share that faith in that vocation themselves. I wonder if they haven't been turned aside from that faith by various developments which have occurred in the time since Kafka and have accelerated in recent years.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but W and Lars talk so much about their own idiocy, their own inability, their own trapped nature between the concrete and the abstract, unable to touch either of them. But they don't so much focus on what some writers, some thinkers that I read focus on, which is the perhaps lessened influence in the modern era, do they?
The lessening influence of thought, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is something which is not diagnosed particularly in this novel, but certainly what we seem to find now is culture has become very populist. It's become much more demotic. It's much broader. It's much more globalized. But at the same time, there's a weakening, a dilution of the importance of particular thinkers. In one sense, it's refreshing that these older norms of charisma have disappeared. But on the other hand, certainly W and Lars, and maybe others too, would feel something important has been lost. In our liberal democracies, everything is tolerated. Everything it can be incorporated. Art was once oppositional, but now it's consumed. It's consumed like anything else. Seriousness, artistic seriousness, perhaps philosophical seriousness too, becomes reduced into a kind of kitsch. Without a consensus of bourgeois taste to rail against, avant-garde energies have dissipated, have lost themselves. And there's a weakening of the suspicions of the market. We're all now forced to work in concert with capitalism rather than setting ourselves against it, I think, at least anyway. So I suppose in that sense this dilution has occurred, and to the extent that the act of writing and perhaps thinking itself becomes problematic or suspicious to these characters as a posture, it's as though they carried with them an equivalent to this the V effect in Brecht, which is supposed to alienate its audience, reminding them that what was before them on stage was an artifice. But now it's the author himself, it's the thinker himself who's alienated, and from the very gestures which in another age or perhaps in another place in old Europe seemed natural.
Discussed in the book, we have the artists we've been talking about, obviously, Béla Tarr, Thomas Bernhard, Kafka, and then we have mentioned other public figures, specifically Peter Andre and Jordan. Why these two extreme ends of the spectrum? I can't think of a greater contrast, at least from what people would think about in the UK, than between Kafka and Peter Andre.
Well, I guess the idea here is to move from high seriousness to low silliness, from lofty conversations to smut. And in doing so, a kind of humour opens up, a very British mode of humour, which derives from shifts of tone. And that's the idea for me, which is captured by the book, a cartoonish energy of the characters as they flit from topic to topic without distinguishing between the profound and the frivolous. So W and Lars are always ready for hyperbole and grand pronouncements, from some fresh account of the end of things, from some fiery revelation of hope. But on the other hand, they're also ready to talk about the most banal things that exist. There's a thinker called Jean Grenier, and he says somewhere, seen in its vastness, existence is tragic. Up close, it's absurdly petty. And that pettiness is something which I'm very keen to foreground in the novel.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas, and I'm Colin Marshall. My guest is philosopher and novelist Lars Iyer, author of the blog Spurious, and now the novel Spurious. If you'd like to hear this conversation again after the show is over, visit colinmarshallradio.com, where you'll find the complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive, all free for the download. Also free for the download, they're all on the iTunes Store. Just search for the Marketplace of Ideas, and there you'll find the Marketplace of Ideas page within the iTunes Store. Everything's downloadable there as well. Questions, comments, feedback, especially guest suggestions, anybody you'd really like to hear interviewed on this show, let me know at Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. That's Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. And if you'd like to be kept up with all things Marketplace of Ideas, info on current and upcoming Marketplace of Ideas conversations, as well as other related interestingness of the internet, you can just sign up for the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list at colinmarshallradio.com. It's there on the Marketplace of Ideas front page. Now, back to the conversation with Lars Iyer on what else but the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. I talk to some people who say that, or who believe that you should, if you're going to be serious about culture, you should keep focused on the Kafkas and the Tarkovskys and ignore the Peter Andres. And then I meet some who say, with equal convincingness, I find, that, well, if you're going to be serious about culture, take the Tarkovskys and the Béla Tarrs, etc. seriously. But if you're going to approach the Peter Andres of the world, you must evaluate them with the same rigor and seriousness you would have evaluated Tarkovsky. Where do you fall on that issue?
Béla Tarr and Tarkovsky are artists I've admired. In the case of Tarkovsky, all my adult life, but at the same time I feel an enormous distance from them. Someone like Tarkovsky as a figure, and perhaps Béla Tarr too, figures like this separate themselves from our ordinary everyday existence in a manner which is enthralling and exciting, but in a manner which also suggests itself to me to be a kind of, it's shot through with a kind of kitschiness, a kind of a lack of acknowledgement of what's occurred. So the artist as prophet, these great artists who put before us works which are like prophecies, I wonder whether they don't pass over much too quickly our ordinary, everyday, banal, mediatized experience. So for me, by inserting these low cultural names, or however we can express them, these figures from celebrity gossip magazines, is a way of acknowledging that this world, the world we live in, has completely transformed, such that, for me at least, I can't quite I can't quite take seriously Béla Tarr Tarkovsky, not anymore. The world they inhabit seems too far away. And Jordan and Peter Andre seem too close. Perhaps the juxtaposition between Peter Andre and Tarr, or Jordan and Tarkovsky in the novel, perhaps this has some kind of critical edge, I'm not sure. Because another accusation would say, if you wallow in this ephemera, then you'll never get to what is most important. I suppose W charges Lars with that, since Lars is the one who reads gossip magazines and surfs gossip websites.
There's another juxtaposition, of course, which is something everybody talks about when they review the book, that W and Lars discuss all of these abstract concepts, or their failure to think about them for real. But at the same time, Lars deals with a growing moisture in his apartment, some problem in the walls that creates a dampness that just gets worse and worse in his apartment, that is very concrete, that he wipes his hand across the wall and moisture and brick and all kinds of stuff just comes off. Was that, first of all, a deliberate choice in that you wanted to have something very, very, very concrete next to the subjects that these characters talk about? Or did, in fact, one of you in real life deal with a moisture problem and that just made it into the book?
Well, both. I mean, I had a terrible problem with damp in this flat I used to live in. It was actually worse than in the novel. I cut a lot of the rest of it out. But the damp for me is linked to the notion of the yard. It's linked to the flat. This is Lars's flat and Lars's yard in Newcastle. These are supposed to be examples of what is absolutely concrete, something you can do nothing about but only come to terms with. So the idea of the damp then for me is to concretize something, to say this is real, this is reality. And of course, what's revealing itself as that reality is something indeterminate, something which cannot quite be pinned down or grasped. It's linked, in my mind at least, I'm not sure if I was explicit about this in the novel, with this Hebrew phrase tohu vavohu, which is used in the book of Genesis in the description of the creation. And we normally translate it as without form or void. And that, for me, is the sense of reality I wanted to convey in Spurious, this sense of something which is without form or void, something chaotic, something which is also apocalyptic, something which seems to break into the world of the characters from its own space, from its own dimension.
But by the end of the book, it also reminded me of a Kafka type situation, like a Kafkan bureaucracy, because it's not going away, and you're not going to. It sounds like Lars isn't going to defeat it in the book, and its malice comes from such an obscure point that it's hard to determine what it's even. How it's doing what it's doing necessarily when you get down to the deepest level. I mean, surely the moisture you dealt with had a solution ultimately in real life.
No solution.
Solution.
Believe me. I can see the flats I used to live in from the window of the house where I now live. And these guys who bought the flat, who are investors, so I don't really feel sorry for them because they're investors. These poor investors, these guys had to totally rebuild the back wall of the kitchen. So in reality, nothing solved the problem. The problem was absolutely awful. And I really did get damp proof after damp proofer out, and all of them are confounded by it. But, this is a way of conveying, in the novel at least, something apocalyptic, something which has its own law, something which, like the scenery Béla Tarr will often film, there is something impending, something doom-laden. Now, the attitudes of the characters towards the damp is curious. W has the faith that it can be cured, it can be addressed. Lars, by contrast, and this is something W links to Lars's Hinduism, thinks all you can do is try to embrace and accept the damp in a particular sense. So W has some kind of faith, and throughout the novel, he's the character who has this grip on what is called messianism, who has some kind of hope. But Lars, by contrast, is someone who thinks all you can do is accept despair, accept what is.
You mentioned W's comments on Lars's Hinduism. Correct me if I'm wrong, but does W not understand the distinction between Hinduism and Buddhism at some points of the book?
You've been reading David Auerbach's review.
I read his blog. He's one of my favorite bloggers, but that's something that occurred to me. Yeah,
it's a wonderful review. And I have to say there that it's certainly not intended to be a conflation of Hinduism and Buddhism. Perhaps it's my conflation. But the Hinduism in the novel, and this is something which the sequel will develop in much more depth, the Hinduism in the novel is linked by W to a kind of fatalism. And this is the old cliche about Hinduism, the sense that what is to happen is preordained. And this is the idea for W that the Hindu can never really experience the apocalypse. For the Jew and for the Catholic, and W is someone who's from a Jewish background, but his family converted. For the Jew, for the Catholic, time is linear. And the end times, the apocalypse, really is the end. But for the Hindu, time is cyclical. And that, for W, is always the get-out clause that Lars has. He's someone who, because of his Hinduism, believes there'll be a time to come after the end of times. So he always has some kind of hope. And that's the notion of moksha, which pops up in the book, the idea of an enlightenment from the idea of a release from the cycle of birth and death.
There's another element of Lars's character, Lars of the book, that struck me, that stood out as something that had to have been a fictional choice, and a choice made purely in this fictional world, because I've seen pictures, and you don't appear to be morbidly obese as you describe Lars in the book as being. So why did you make him fat when you aren't fat?
I didn't make him fat. W calls him fat.
Oh, okay. So he might not be fat.
He might not be fat, that's right.
Interesting.
So, this could be a shtick between the characters, and David Auerbach is very good in his discussion of the way this works in the novel. We shouldn't take everything W says about Lars for granted, and certainly this obesity is something which W might be wrong about.
And there's something in the way that, in the voice of the novel is, of course, in the voice of the character Lars, and he quotes, I mean, most of the book, I would say, is him quoting W, or much of it anyway, and there's a certain slippage between the voices of the characters. I mean, because he always quotes W, Lars quotes W as, and I'm going to maybe mangle the way this works, but Lars refers to himself as I, even when he's quoting W, talking about Lars. And I know the listener might have a hard time grasping this, but how do you describe the technique that I might or might not be getting across here?
Well, I guess the whole novel works through reported speech, reported conversation. So Lars is reporting in a pretty deadpan, affectless way what W is saying, what W thinks, what W believes. So it's a strange kind of portrait that's mediated through Lars the narrator. And as the narrator, Lars doesn't really say a great deal. He doesn't really do a great deal. He doesn't really report very much in the first person. But actually the whole novel is a way of conveying W's impressions of life, the universe, and everything.
And these impressions and these pieces of dialogue, of course, they started off on your blog, Spurious, and this is unlike any blog-to-book transition that I've seen before, because this is the kind of thing that's begun happening in the publishing world as blog material will become something else in book form. And you mentioned David Auerbach's review, and of course he blogs under the name Waggish, and he mentions in that review that we both started blogging anonymously, and then deciding it was futile, sort of discarded the idea of anonymity. Is that what actually happened in your case? There was anonymity, which you then put away?
That's right. I only put it away this year. So blogging for me was a very, very great experience, very important to me. I began my blog in 2003, and I did so because I wanted the freedom to write outside of the norms and standards of academic writing. Those norms and standards are very important, and they're vital to learn. I'd written at that stage a few papers, a book, all this sort of thing, but I wanted to be able to explore certain ideas in a more unconventional way, in a manner which would perform some of the ideas, not simply report them from without. I wanted to develop these ideas without censorship. I wanted to somehow tap into what the poet René Char calls my legitimate strangeness. I wanted to wonder. I wanted to be stupid in some sense. I wanted to also find another relation to people, not bound by the normal social rules. So between my blog and Waggish and other blogs like Steve Mitchell-Moore's This Space, there was a possibility of communicating and relating which was very different to what we find in our normal social lives. Often when we meet, we're unable to really get to what we really might want to talk to each other about. The Russian poet Svetayeva says that she doesn't like meetings in real life. She says that meetings in real life lead to the banging together of foreheads. You have two walls. You just cannot penetrate. And what she says is, a meeting should be an arch. Then the meeting is above, and your foreheads are tilted back. And that, for me, was what happened between bloggers. So it was an extraordinary period in which we were allowed to develop various kinds of personae. And this wasn't simply a playing with masks. We wanted to think something, we wanted to push something through out of a sense of necessity, to honour certain ideas which other people have had, to try to be consistent with where our writing was taking us. So that, for me, was what was utopian about blogging, certainly for the first few years. I must say that, like many others, I really began to run out of steam after 4 or 5 years. And I pushed the blog in the direction where we now find it, where it's largely a repository of W posts of bits and pieces which will be maybe assembled into something later on, but maybe not. But for a long time, I felt very much part of something incredibly exciting, a brand new medium in which people could communicate anonymously without any cultural baggage.
This brings me to a phenomenon that I've witnessed more recently in the world of blogs and the world of these types of blogs as well, which is now that the masks have, maybe masks, as we said, is kind of the wrong word, but now that the identities used specifically for blogging have fallen away or been put away, a few more conflicts have arisen. For example, here I was happily reading Waggish, happily reading Steve Mitchell-Moore's This Space, happily reading Spurious, and I find both Steve Mitchell-Moore and David Auerbach, Waggish, are very much fans of Spurious, but then I see some obscure conflict has erupted between the two of them, and apparently, I mean, there are many of these sort of roiling, I don't know if rivalries is the word, or sort of animosities that aren't really necessarily clear on the surface, but that nonetheless surprise me. I mean, does it surprise you to find these things go on?
I'm of a different temperament, so I suppose I don't really feel involved in these kinds of things, but like other bloggers, I would have shared when I was taking blogging more seriously, a sense of the seriousness of the ideas I was dealing with, not my own ideas, but the ideas of the thinkers I was trying to convey. And it can be very difficult if you think other people are not taking those ideas seriously. It can be difficult if you think others are being flippant about something or being silly about something. My way of dealing with these sorts of issues was different. I'm just of a different sort of temperament. But certainly I can see how people can get very angry, very cross, very frustrated. In a certain sense, I envy them that, because that kind of seriousness, that investment in what it is they're doing is exactly what I admire in someone like Kafka. It's what I admire in someone like Béla Tarr.
I do think that this is a great time to be engaged with these ideas, the kind of artworks that you write about, or that David Auerbach writes about, or that Steve Mitchell-Moore writes about. But with the proliferation of outlets for discussion for these kinds of things, these kind of matters, I've also experienced a slight, maybe more than slight, disappointment that the discussions of the Tarkovskys, of the Tarrs, of the Thomas Bernhards of the world, they have trouble breaking out of these smallish arenas on the internet into the world at large. And part of me says, if if Tarkovsky is not getting through to the world at large to some degree, why am I discussing Tarkovsky? Why am I thinking about Tarkovsky? Is it personal pleasure? Well, that's kind of masturbatory, isn't it? I mean, do you understand what I mean? I love Béla Tarr's films, but I want them to touch humanity, and it bothers me that I can't necessarily make that happen myself.
I think that's as an aim, it's a noble aim. It's something which you do at Marketplace of Ideas, trying to put these ideas across to people in an accessible format. Before I ran the blog Spurious, I had a joint blog with Steve Mitchell-Moore and others, and on that blog, our mission was to try to introduce readers to figures like Tarkovsky, to figures like Blanchot. That was the mission of that particular blog. And for me, the idea was, how can I communicate and reach out in such a way that the young person I was, thirsty for ideas, thirsty for certain kinds of experience, would be able to come into contact with these ideas. When I was young, Channel 4 showed a series of Tarkovsky films. I knew nothing about Tarkovsky. I knew nothing about film, really. I just remember the trailers were absolutely beautiful. And I remember sitting down and watching Solaris, then Mirror, then Stalker, with absolute awe. I've never had an experience so intense as that, or at least at that time I hadn't, of art. And I remember in that period going to London and walking through London and suddenly hearing someone say the name Tarkovsky. I remember going up to them and talking to them, actually falling into conversation. I found a fellow Tarkovsky fan in Covent Garden. Well, that experience is something which is almost unimaginable now because we have the internet. On the one hand, okay, so what we've had with the internet, there's a kind of niche for Tarkovsky, for Béla Tarr, and as you're saying, I think quite rightly, nothing comes out from this niche into culture more broadly, and that's a tragedy. But on the other hand, there is that niche, and that for me is something absolutely incredible. Before blogs, before I began reading them, and the first blog I read was Steve Mitchell-Moore's blog Splinters. Before that point, I didn't have anyone to talk to about film or music or art or fiction. This was something I felt was profoundly lacking. And that's what the internet provided for me, and I'm sure other people like me. That niche is something of enormous importance. I wish we could step out of that niche. I wonder whether that's possible.
And yes, I don't want to give the impression that I don't enjoy the niche, but I do nevertheless have certain moments of despair about, well, I'll give you an illustration. In the States here, I will often talk about, I will often wish there were more chances to see Tarkovsky films in the public sphere, or to read the sort of literature we've discussed. I mean, the opportunities are out there, but I wish they had more of a presence, is what I mean. More of a presence in the culture, because I think it would make that richer to even the niche hardcore fans, who are into these artists, into these thinkers. But then people always say here, well, if you want Tarkovsky or whomever to have a greater presence, you've got to demand some tax dollars and make it into something that's literally a branch of the public sphere, something governmental in a sense. But then I always feel a strong conflict because, Andrei Tarkovsky, would he have wanted to be part of the state, effectively? Do you know what I mean? There's that conflict there that I can't resolve.
I suppose there's always something shameful about going to the state and asking for money. I suppose this is something which Werner Herzog would in particular decry. I think, how does he put it? He talks about money. He talks about funding, public funding, as being a cur that you have to make fall behind you, in some sense. But on the other hand, I think you're absolutely right to suggest that this is the only way in which this sort of material can gain more general exposure. I mean, I suppose it does happen to some extent at universities and perhaps in university film clubs. But, of course, one would want this more broadly culturally. Over in Britain, on our terrestrial channels, you will not be able to see a Tarkovsky film, a Bergman film, a Fellini film. When I was young, these were still being shown. Now they're not. And this is a tragedy. So I'm not sure what can be done about this. I suppose what encourages me is seeing the way that young people I come into contact with have an enormous musical knowledge. If they're interested in music, they've been able to download, they've been able to dig up from obscure corners albums or the works of artists which took me 20 years to find. So there is a way in which people who are interested in these sorts of things will find it, and via the internet they'll build it up around them. They'll gradually equip themselves with a broad grasp of film, of music, of these sorts of things. That at least is my hope. When it comes to fiction, I suppose, well, fiction takes a lot of effort to read. I mean, it's very hard to read, say, Proust or Musil or Kafka. These sorts of figures take such a commitment of time. I wonder whether that's something which is not going to diminish and diminish and diminish.
Toward the beginning of Spurious, of the novel, there is a conversation between, well, it's all a conversation between W and Lars, but toward the beginning they talk about, or W talks about his regret that they've somehow been poisoned by literature, that literature got them and made them slightly less serious than they could have been. Now, that's a point of view I can't imagine you personally sharing, that literature makes you less able to think. Do you share it?
I think that one of the problems is, W's identifying here, is going into philosophy from literature. Now, it's of course really wonderful to have a background in reading and in culture in this sense. This is very rich. But to go into philosophy with a background in maths and science, now that I think is much more exciting, much more potentially fruitful. There's a lot of us who've gone into philosophy via literature, who turned up at university with sort of vague enthusiasm for Nietzsche. There's a lot of us like this, which is in its own way valuable. But on the other hand, I think those coming from scientific backgrounds, from mathematical backgrounds, they can bring something to philosophy which, especially European philosophy, which might otherwise be absent.
There's a line in the book that I had to write down because it seemed to speak so much to a situation that some of the philosophers or aspiring philosophers I've talked to find themselves in, which is somehow everything has to do with God, in which W is not capable of believing, and mathematics, which W is not capable of doing. Now, how common a rock and a hard place situation is that?
So I suppose God stands in here for the idea of believing in something that's worthwhile believing in. Having some kind of faith in something which is intrinsically valuable. And this is, of course, the problem we've had in the West, diagnosed by Nietzsche, the problem we've had that we cannot believe in God, most of us at least. We cannot believe, there's nothing to believe in, nothing that we can dedicate ourselves to with that kind of commitment. So I suppose that's what God stands in for in the novel, for me at least. It's not simply about our relationship to religious traditions, which, I mean, this is something Nietzsche's expressed very well. As he says, the waters of religion are ebbing away and leaving behind swamps or stagnant pools. It's not merely about religion in that sense. It's about the idea of believing in something. Mathematics, perhaps in the novel, becomes for W something in which one can believe. One believes in it, though, for W, because one's removed from it. So it has a similar role to the role of God. Of course, the reason why these two ideas come up in proximity to one another is because they're linked in the thought of Hermann Cohen, who's one of the philosophers W is reading. And in Hermann Cohen's work, in particular, the infinitesimal calculus is regarded as being particularly important in understanding what God might mean. So that's how they come up for Will with W with such force.
In the David Auerbach review of the book that we were talking about before, he does, and I bring this up because of the full range of ideas we've brought up. He mentions that, you might be able to read this book and sort of ignore the specifics of the ideas discussed and focus on the way in which they're discussed, the dynamic between W and Lars that they use to discuss these works of art, these thoughts, these writings. Do you think Spurious is approachable as a book that's purely of this dialogue form, even if you know nothing about any of the figures that they point to and say, look, these are gods, these are their ideas? Can you simply take it as a purely conversational form without all these elaborate references?
I greatly hope so. That's my most fervent wish with the book, that people are not put off by the idea that they have to have any deep cultural knowledge to appreciate what's going on in it. The names are stand-ins which could be replaced by others. So the name Kafka in the book could be substituted by that of any great author whose shadow falls over us. And likewise Rosenzweig, who's another important figure. On the one hand, his name could stand in for that of any great philosopher, tackling the great themes of philosophy. But on the other hand, if you know something about Rosenzweig, then perhaps it becomes more interesting. It becomes more clear exactly what's going on with these characters. But certainly for me, one of the things I most hope is that people will approach the book who have no background whatsoever in philosophy, no great background in literature. They simply enjoy the to and fro, the dialogue.
Now, Melville House has put on the back of the book, watch for the sequel coming in 2012, Dogma. I believe I've heard rumor of perhaps even the possibility of a third book. Is this novel the tip of an iceberg? Is that what we're reading right now?
Well, there hopefully will be 3 books in print, and the 3 books will describe an arc in terms of the ideas being discussed in them. Spurious, as you've seen, introduces the characters, and I suppose the general framework of that book is Judaism. So Judaism gives the main philosophical framework for Spurious. Dogma, by contrast, concerns Hinduism, and in particular Lars' relationship to Hinduism, which is foregrounded much more in that text. And that, so in the third book, which will be called Exodus, the framework is a Christian one, and it's concerned with things like Armageddon, with the Revelation, with these sorts of issues. And the other concern of Exodus is political. And the idea for me is across the 3 novels, we chart 3 particular kinds of despair. We look at literary despair, philosophical despair, political despair. And by the end of the third novel, I think one of the things I want to do is to ground W and Lars's characters quite clearly within the context of contemporary neoliberal Britain. That's what I'm quite keen to do, is to show how the despair and melancholy really has quite a determinate source.
I've been speaking with Lars Iyer, philosopher and novelist, author of Spurious, the first book of 3 that I am now looking very much forward to. Indeed. Lars, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thank you.
If you'd like to learn more about Lars Iyer and Spurious, visit spurious.typepad.com. That is spurious.typepad.com. If you'd like to hear our conversation again, visit colinmarshallradio.com, where you'll find it in the complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive there, or on iTunes. Search in the iTunes store for the Marketplace of Ideas, and there you'll find all the episodes free for the download as well. You can find the website of Ben Althouse, the man who makes our theme music, at benalthouse.com. And if you have any feedback, send that along to Colin, Colin, at colinmarshallradio.com. You can be kept up on all things Marketplace of Ideas, current upcoming conversations, other related neat stuff and all that on the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. You can sign up for it on the front page of the Marketplace of Ideas website, findable very easily at colinmarshallradio.com. As always, thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time on the Marketplace of Ideas for more cultural conversation of the depth you demand.